Mm.
She had come in trying to save her sister and her sister's child that supposedly had been in that same apartment house, but they were gone already. And so she looked at me and she said, I'll save you instead.
Oh, wow.
And she did. We didn't know whether she would or not because it involved making papers ahead of us so that when we did get over from the ghetto over the wall, we should have someplace to go to. You couldn't just dump yourself on the street.
Right.
And after a couple of weeks, she did. We heard from her again. She had the papers, and we had the instructions on how to get out of the ghetto. My father didn't want to go. He had been there. By that time, he was one of the militia people. Well, I don't know if you could call it militia, but one of the four, they had Jewish people who were trying to um, resist the Nazis. And in fact, they did resist them for many months. But we were already, the resistance took place in early 1943. And we left about 2 or 3 weeks before the resistance. And the resistance was pretty severe.
Wow.
So we had um, arranged for the manner of leaving, which involved my mother and myself to all get over the wall around the ghetto at the dark of the night. And the papers were going to be somebody would pick us up on the other side, and they did. So my father took me over the fence, and I never knew. I always assumed somehow or other, even though he let me go to the top and then somebody caught me on the other side. For some reason, I always assumed that it would be he who would catch me on the other side. But I was still pretty young, and it wasn't he. And all of a sudden, I found myself in my stranger's arms. My mother had gone before me, and she was told to stand by a different tree. The point was, each one would not give away, nor could we talk to each other. And I was standing there freezing and feeling very scared because there was nobody telling me what to do or what will happen, just abandoned. But ultimately, somebody came. They picked up my mother, they picked up me. My father stayed in the ghetto, and he did get killed. And that one of the reasons that he probably felt that way is because it was much more difficult to hide a man, especially because Jewish men were circumcised, Polish
Mm.
men were not. So if there was any question, and if you were dark haired or looked Jewish, pull your pants down, and that's the end of you.
Wow.
So, and it had been arranged for me to go to a convent.
Okay.
So we stayed there for a few days together, my mother and I, in some room that somebody had taken us to. And I was given instructions, given a new name. You may not talk about this, you may not talk about that as of now. And I'm 6 years old. You are an orphan, and you may never tell anybody anything other than your new name. And it's my new name was Teresa Kurek. And when I was in the convent, one of the difficult parts were my mother was never allowed to see me. She was working as a maid in a Christian household, which had also been arranged. It was a pretty hard job for her. But she was never allowed to see me, and I wasn't allowed to ask, is she alive? Is she not alive? What about my father? What's happening? I was just not allowed. I was supposedly a Christian orphan, period.
Wow.
One of the reasons that they were able to save me is because my Polish was good. Sometimes some of the Jewish people did not speak Polish as well, which would give them away.
Is your Polish still good?
Oh, my Polish is terrible. My accent is good. My vocabulary is awful. This is what a Polish person told me, and they're right. So, anyway, I stayed in the convent, and it was very hard. I stayed there for, I think, close to 3 years. But I never, they talk about it these days, children, you have to know who you are. They're talking about people understanding who are you really? Who are you? Well, I had no idea who I am, and I was afraid to ask, and I was afraid to talk. And in retrospect, I wasn't the only one. There was quite a number of Jewish kids who had been saved in that convent.
Mm.
And by the way, not all the convents were as nice. There were a good number of convents that took in some Jewish children because they were paid for it. But when the money ran out, they gave them up to whoever, the Germans or whatever. I mean, they
Not
just
very
deserted them.
godly of those
Pardon?
nuns. Not very godly of those nuns.
No, godly
very
and religion
Christian.
is, no, not very godly. But in this convent, the nuns were really very nice.
Mm.
And I don't ever remember being mistreated.
Oh, that's very nice.
And I even remember one time when they knew that there was going to be an inspection by Germans, and they tried to take away some of the Jewish children. They took us on a horsey buggy ride to be away for a couple of hours. And then they brought us back. But the convent itself became a difficult place because it was really, at one time, it had been a very nice convent at one time. And because it was a very nice convent in a very nice area of Warsaw, the Germans decided they wanted to have it for their building. So they had no place to put us.
Oh, no.
And so they divided the convent into 2 or 3 different groups. And I was in a group that went to Kozlo, and they put us basically into a chicken coop. It's the only place they had.
That's terrible.
Well, there were no chickens in it. There was just us.
That's still terrible.
As a matter of fact, we would have preferred that there were
Probably,
chickens,
right?
because
Eggs.
there was not enough to eat.